So here is Section 6, Media Institutions, Part 1. So we're kind of through talking about texts. And if you remember, at the beginning of the semester, we're talking about when you do an analysis, you really have to look at both the text and the context. Well, one of the contexts behind doing analysis of text, one of the contexts would be understanding who made the piece, the media text, right? Who are the businesses that are in play here? And so we're going to look at some of those businesses, but also just looking at how the media industry works as an entity, as an industry, characteristics of it, concerns that people have with the media. We'll take a look at that too. So probably the biggest, if we talk about the media, one thing that we can talk about is we can talk about bias. We can talk about content, whether you think there's too much sex, violence, whatever, whether there's fake news, all those kind of things. But if you look at some of the heart of all of this, one of the biggest conversations that is always had about the media is the fact that there's so few choices, and that the companies involved in the media are consolidating, which is to say they're merging together, buyouts, And so the big issue here in talking about the media first is to discuss how do we want these media companies to be structured? How many do we want in the United States and the world? The media industry is heavily consolidated. A lot of times people will, and this number changes, but they'll talk about the big five, the big six. At any given point in time, in any year, you can try to look at an ownership chart and try to figure out who owns what. And it gets confusing because they're constantly in play with one another, trying to buy each other out or buying stakes in each other's business. So you have one company that may be buying out or buying into shares into a subsidiary company owned by another media company. And it's posturing and positioning and trying to get ready for buyouts. These are large industry companies. If you look at pure lobbying weight, in other words, how much money is spent lobbying for this industry, the media is right up there with military defense companies, defense contractors. So in either in the top 2 or top 3 of all lobbying efforts is what I'm saying. There's tons of money going back and forth here. You got to remember, when we're talking about media companies now, media has blown up so much that we're not just talking about television stations or newspapers. We're talking about internet providers, content providers. We're talking about wireless phones. So that industry has really blossomed at the same time as it's blossoming, and all these new technologies come about and change what the industry looks like. Companies are trying to position themselves to buy out one another so that they can corner the market, really. And so you think about that and you think, well, do I want that market cornered? Do I want one company in charge of most of my media that I watch? Now, the media industry is not the only industry out there, the only sector that is heavily consolidated. If you think, there's other key industries out there that are consolidated. For example, oil. Name all the oil companies out there that you can, and you probably can't get more than 10 fingers. If you count them on your fingers, you probably can't fully use both hands. We have BP, Exxon, Chevron, Texaco, And then you start running into issues of trying to figure out, well, who else is there out there? You know, mobile. So if you think about oil, it's heavily consolidated. Not a lot of oil companies out there. Same thing if you think about a computer. If you go to buy a computer, how many brands are out there? How many companies offer you a product? Phone, if you go to buy a cell phone right now, how many different companies can you buy from? And I'm not talking about cell phone as a media product. I'm talking about as a technology product. You know, you have Apple, you have Samsung, Galaxy, Android. But you don't have a lot of choices there. So if you think about it, that the media industry is consolidating just like almost all other industries are consolidating. You know, think of sports apparel. Nike, Reebok, Adidas, Under Armour. That's an industry also that's heavily consolidated. So we know that you know, industries like to do this. They like to consolidate. So what's the issue, right? What's the problem? That the media industry is doing it just like everything else, like oil and steel and agriculture. There's only a handful of big agriculture businesses that provide most of the world's food. So if you think about all this stuff, what's the difference with the media? And in particular, when we're talking about the media and we're thinking about, well, why is this important? It's heavily relevant towards the United States. Why? Because we're a democracy. One vote counts, right? Everyone's vote counts. And if you think about it, the First Amendment gives us the freedom of press, right? Why does it give us that? Because the founding fathers at the time thought there needs to be a healthy press system that questions authority, right? So these guys, they were writing stuff about the tyranny of the British Empire in controlling the colonies. And so when they are being punished for telling their stories, for writing their stories down, for reporting on events that happened that were unfavorable to the British, they were being punished for all these things. When they sit down to write the Constitution, that's the First Amendment. The first thing in there that they specify as a right is the right to freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. They want to be able to critique things, big things in power. They're setting themselves up, most definitely, to be a democracy. That's what they want. So they want freedom of information. So if you think through this and put two and two together, what they're saying is, if we're going to be a democracy and everyone's going to get a chance to vote for something, they need to be informed. If I have a choice between A and B, I want to know facts about A. I want to know facts about B. I want to know the difference. I want to have an informed decision, and that's what the First Amendment was about when they talked about freedom of the press, the right to get information freely without being restricted. So that's kind of when I say what's the difference between these other industries and the media industry. Well, the media industry is at the very heart of our democracy. If you don't think so, then you have not been paying attention since the election of 2016, right? The media is a huge part of our politics now. And you have government attacking media and media attacking government, right? And so they're squaring off against one another. And all of this is going to have an impact in the next election cycle. Doesn't matter when that election cycle is. In fact, maybe the next election cycle, but also the election cycle after that, and the one after that, and the one after that, and the one after that. All of them are going to have some relationship to what the media is saying at that current time. And that's why we worry so much about media consolidation, because if we don't have a diversity of voices, if we don't have a multitude of voices giving us information, if it comes down to just one or two big industries, they control the information, which will control the democracy, right? So it is very important to think about consolidating media and how that has large political, social ramifications. So when we get into a debate about this, about whether you should support consolidation or you should be against consolidation, the big argument that we're really having is localism versus efficiency, right? And this is an argument about whether you want your media to be focused on local aspects or whether you want the media to run efficiently as a business. Okay? Because those two things, they can occur together, but for the most part, they're going to be opposed. An emphasis on localism versus an emphasis on efficiency, especially when we talk about big companies. Okay? So let's look at each of those things individually. Why there's an argument for localism, why there's an argument for efficiency. So, and you know what? Before we get any further into this, just to make sure that you understand the level of consolidation that we have, I want to draw in this little chart right here. Again, it's hard to get these little charts because all these business deals, they're constantly moving and shifting and turning. So trying to pin down what the media looks like at any given time is very difficult. So let's just take a look at this one, which is from, hey, I need to get my teeth cleaned. I need to turn off notifications is what I need to do. Hold on one second. Yeah, we'll try that. So, if we look at, sorry, that throws me for a loop too. Spam mail. When we look at this media landscape, okay, let's look at the big players. So, you see the size of these circles. That's their impact. That's how large they are. Okay. One thing before we get into the details here, this that says relative market cap, what does that mean? That means if you were to buy every share of that company for what the share is currently worth, that's the amount of money you would need. In other words, if you were to walk in to Wall Street office somewhere and say, I want to buy Apple, I just want to buy it outright, I want to own it, you would need $928 billion. Almost $1 trillion to buy Apple. Amazon, $836 billion. Google, $814 billion. Facebook, $574 billion. Now you know why this industry spends so much in lobbying, because we are talking about multiple trillion-dollar companies, or right at $1 trillion. Okay. So let's look at what we have here. We have, and the circles are sized by market cap, so that's what we're talking about, the biggest, with the biggest amounts of money. Disney. All right, so Disney owns ESPN, ABC, Marvel Studios, Lucasfilm, right? It is in a deal right now to buy 21st Century Fox. So, and I think the latest offer was about 60-something million, or 60-something billion. But if we just look at what 21st Century Fox owns, it's 20th Century Studios, Fox Cable, which includes Fox News and Nat Geo, FS1, all of the Fox-related channels. Fox Broadcast, so like the actual Fox network, just like you have at ABC, CBS, right? So, I mean, what you're looking at here is Disney saying, we want to own this, which Disney would then have control of ABC and Fox, right? 21st Century Fox has a 30% stake in Hulu, as does Disney right now. So when they buy out 21st Century Fox, guess who they're also going to get a controlling interest of? Hulu. So if you think about Hulu competing against ABC, Hulu competing against Fox, that relationship's going to be very interesting should this thing be bought out. Right? Over here, and by the way, this also shows content. So these are content providers. In other words, they're making shows. They're making magazines. They're making whatever. Right? They're making the actual content. Down here we have Netflix, which is just hanging around at 170 billion with 125 million subscribers. It's streaming video, which that's correct, but I would say that this chart is even not taking into account that Netflix is now starting to make content. I mean, there's tons of Netflix originals on there, right? So they're making content, and that content will eventually, if Netflix can find a way to sell some of that, I'm sure they will. But it's hanging out here, right? Trying to become a major player, thinking about buying into things, buying out things, right? So we also have over here AT&T Time Warner. It's buying out this company called Otter Media. That's a small check to write for $1 billion. But Time Warner has 20 million video subscribers. What do you mean by that? Well, I mean, they are a distribution system as well as a content system, right? So you can get your cable and your internet through AT&T Time Warner. But Warner is also making content, right? Warner Brothers Studio is making content. HBO makes content. Turner has content, CNN, TNT, TBS. Time Warner also owns DirecTV. And guess what? They've also got a stake in Hulu. Right? Verizon. Verizon is sitting there at almost $200 billion. And you think about what it owns. It doesn't own much besides itself. It is a major, major distribution system. So, you have your phone through Verizon. A lot of people in other parts of the country have their internet through Verizon. So Verizon's a major player here. And a lot of people don't think about that, but, consider that. Comcast. So Comcast owns DreamWorks, a slew of cable stations. These are not all them, by the way. This is just pointing out some of the bigger ones that they own. But Comcast owns NBC, basically, right? So it's a major player. Universal Studios. Comcast is also an internet and cable provider, so this also is in play. It wants to buy out Sky Media, which is an international distribution system, right? So it's this is a contested bid. In other words, some people are saying that Comcast can't own it, and at the time I can't really remember what the argument is, but I think it's that it would get to be too big of a distribution system, right? I guess some people still do have limits on how big a monopoly can get, but But anyway, so that's a huge system. I know one of the issues that's taking place is the fact that 21st Century Fox has a large, if not controlling, stake of Sky. They were essentially the same company. One was the American branch, one was the European branch. Charter provides broadband service. Cox does as well. Dish has 13 million subscribers, right? Then you have Sony hanging out here that's making a bunch of content. Viacom, which used to be massive. Viacom, which used to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest player in media. You can see these companies now that are priming themselves to have both content and distribution are outplaying Viacom. Viacom doesn't really have any way to distribute. It has content. It has all of CBS, Showtime, Paramount. Viacom is NBC, or not NBC, is MTV, rather. Comedy Central. So Viacom is a very big content provider. But you look at this, okay, and you see that, you know, if a lot of these deals go through, this gets swallowed up, which will swallow up some of this stuff too. Disney, Time Warner, Comcast become beasts. And if Disney ever goes into a distribution system, which guess what? They're trying to come up with a streaming service right now to compete against Netflix. They're going to have tons of content to compete against Netflix, right? So major players here. And that means all the ideas that you get that are going to come through the media are coming through this big bubble, this bubble, this bubble, right? It's in terms of major players. So we go back to our discussion. Why do people argue for localism? Well, localism is just this idea that you want to spread the power apart so that you get as many different voices as possible, right? So if you think about back at that media chart, if everyone's getting their information from Disney or Time Warner, everyone's getting the same information. That bias that may be present in that company gets exponentially larger. Localism argues if we'll break this big company up, treat it like a monopoly, break it apart, then these individual pieces will have to serve their own local communities. Why have Time Warner own your local news? I guess a better example would be Disney. Why have Disney control your local ABC station, right? Or your local Fox station? Why have Disney do that? Why not make your local Fox station actually owned locally? Have your ABC station owned locally so that its first priority is to serve the people of that community. So that's the idea, that if we broke all this apart and distributed it locally, you would get a company that best serves the local community needs. And it would lead to a diversity of content, because someone who's giving me content in Starkville, Mississippi, they're prioritizing things different than if they were providing content to someone in New York City. There's things that might be of interest to people in New York City that aren't going to be of interest to people in Starkville, Mississippi. And so you get this diversity of content. This kind of flows off of the original idea of making sure you had a diversity of thought. And that the example kind of flows back to the FCC in its original days when it was created and the concept behind it. So the FCC is the Federal Communications Commission, okay? It's a collection, or it's a commission of people that are politically appointed. They're presidential appointees. They have a chairman, which oversees the agenda, okay, runs all the business meetings, does stuff like that. But they're just in charge of communication-related issues. And one of the reasons why they got started was because in the early days of radio, when radio was first used popularly, there was a rush of people thinking, just like they do now, when we had the internet boom in the late 90s and the early noughts. You have all these companies racing out there to grab a piece of that industry. Radio was the same way. Anybody who thought they could erect a tower and had enough money to broadcast out of it was trying to do so. The FCC knew at the time, or the government rather, the government knew at the time that there was a limited amount of spectrum. Spectrum is the airwaves that all these signals are traveling through, right? And so they saw spectrum as a finite, limited thing. There can only be so many wavelengths that you broadcast on. And the government was afraid if everyone rushes out there and grabs up these wavelengths, these frequencies, then as a government, we're not going to have access to as much as we need. So we need to delegate this stuff, and we need to be cautious about how we license these airwaves, these frequencies and wavelengths, right? And we need to make sure that we have some for our own use, because if there's a national emergency or there's any reason why we would need the space, say radio waves for military talking back and forth, we need that space. So the job of the FCC, the reason why the FCC was created, was basically to look over that licensing process, was to say, okay, well, Tom Smith wants to apply for a certain frequency to broadcast a radio station on. Okay, so let's look at his application. And maybe there was a competing interest from someone else, not just Tom Smith, but John Williams. So John Williams and Tom Smith, they've both applied to operate on the same frequency. The FCC would make a determination of who's going to get that frequency in that area, in that geographic location. Right? The broadcast bubble is only so far, but within the same market, the FCC, if they see two companies or two people contesting the same frequency, they have to make a determination. Well, the FCC, one of the things that went into their deliberations was, how does this person, this applicant, serve the public need with their station? Right? With their operation, how do they best serve the local community? And whoever could demonstrate that they would serve the community best, that's the one that is likely to get that frequency. And so what that means is that the FCC was originally constructed to favor localism and diversity of thought, right? If you had two people competing for a frequency and they say, well, we're both going to cover agricultural news, and you already know that there's 2 or 3 channels out there devoted to agricultural news, maybe you decide, well, we're not going to release that frequency to either of you. Why don't you shift your emphasis, right? We don't want a whole bunch of people just talking about ag. Talk about something else, right? Still serve the local community, though. So that was an emphasis. We'll talk about how that original emphasis over time has just corroded. And in fact, if you look historically, you would think that the FCC, because of how it was originated, would favor more local voices, therefore saying they don't want as much consolidation. You would think that would be their argument. That the FCC would say, no, we don't want all these companies joining together and being one. It cuts down on diversity of thought. In actuality, what you have to remember is that the FCC is a political appointment. So these people are really serving the interests of whatever the administration is at the time. And so what we have seen, because big business is tied so tight to politics, what we have seen is over time, even though originally FCC was supposed to be against consolidation, kind of, it's a hard argument, but kind of, what they've actually done is they fostered consolidation. They favored consolidation because the administration under which they work most of the time was favoring that consolidation as well. Flip side of the argument is efficiency. Why have consolidation? Well, because just like there's a political First Amendment reason of why you want a diversity of thought and diversity of content, America is very much also the land of free enterprise and capitalism. And we have ideas about if you want to start a business, as long as you're being legal, the government should stay out of it. The government shouldn't have much to do with how you run your business at all, unless you're doing something illegal. And so a lot of people see this and go, well, look, the government needs to lay off putting all these restrictions on how we do business. We do business just like everyone else does business. We sell a product. We try to sell a good product at a cheap price. We try to get profits. And that profit we're going to reinvest back into the business so we can grow. Right? Why do they want to grow? Because if you think about it, the bigger a company becomes, the more cost saving it can enjoy and a better product it hopes to give to the consumer. Think about Walmart. Walmart is probably a great example. As Walmart, going all the way back to the early 80s, when I first remember Walmart coming out, their point was to grow, 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 take over more markets, more markets, more markets. Once they did that and they anchored themselves and established themselves in so many communities, what Walmart can do is Walmart can say, okay, well, we're going to stock in our stores red plastic cups, right? But we're not just going to have red plastic cups at just the stores in Arkansas. We're going to have red plastic cups at the stores in Arkansas and California and Washington State and Florida and Maine and Massachusetts. We need red plastic cups everywhere. So what does it do? You save money by buying in bulk, right? Just like when you go to Sam's or any of these kind of big discount houses, right? Costco, I think, is another competitor. Sam's, Costco. You understand the concept. Walmart wants that same concept. Walmart goes to a company in China and says, can you make this many red plastic cups for us? And we're talking about millions and millions of red plastic cups. Well, as you scale up, the cost per unit goes down, just like at Sam's or Costco. You know, buying one roll of toilet paper is going to cost you so much per roll. If you buy 20 rolls of toilet paper at a time, then per unit it's cheaper. The same thing's happening at Walmart. McDonald's, same way, right? McDonald's is saying, well, you know, we don't just make hamburgers at 5 cities in America. We make hamburgers in almost all the cities. So when it is ordering beef, it's buying in large bulk and then distributing it. It can turn up the profit because it's made it when it purchased the beef, they purchased it at such a low rate, right? This is called economies of scale, this belief, and it works. I mean, it's a known thing. That's why people want to get bigger. The more that we produce, the cheaper it becomes per item, right? If you think about a brewery and how it's constantly making beer all day long, and you think about how much money has to be put into that assembly line to produce that beer, all the money that has to be invested in that assembly line. And if you only made 20 bottles of beer, that'd be a pretty expensive cost. That beer would probably be very expensive. Now, if we make 200,000 bottles of beer in a day, the assembly line, we can cut the cost of what it took for us to buy that assembly line. We can cut that by the 200,000 bottles that we just made. So it becomes cheaper to make one item. Say it's Coca-Cola or beer or whatever. Well, what we do is we just apply that same theory to the media, and it works. If you think about radio, is probably the easiest thing to come up with an example on this. If you look at how this media consolidation works, you have one company that owns 300 stations across the United States. In the past, when it was just one owner, one station, you may have to have 4 or 5 DJs to run that station. And so you're paying them all, for 40-hour shifts, if not more. You're running that station, okay? You're paying those people. Those people have a career at that one station. So let's transfer that now to owning 300 stations. Let's also throw in the fact that we have new technology. So in the old days, where you had a DJ that was live behind the microphone, actually putting records onto a record player and playing them out for everybody, actually putting CDs into a CD player or tapes into a tape deck or whatever, you had a person there reading what the weather was at the moment, what the time was at the moment. Now what we have is a system of automation in radio. In other words, just like you build a playlist in iTunes or Spotify or whatever, you build a playlist for that radio station's broadcast. You go ahead and you mark down where we're going to play this song, then this song, a third song, then we're going to take a break for commercials. But all the commercials are recorded digitally, just like the songs, so we'll just plug them into the playlist right there. And then we'll plug in the DJ coming on and telling us something that we may need to hear. Maybe they're giving us announcements as to future events, but we know that event is 3 or 4 days down the road, so we can go ahead and talk about it, And so what happens is that DJ who used to be live behind a microphone now is pre-recording spots that make it seem like he's live in the studio, but he's not. It's already been recorded. It's just been slid into a playlist like everything else in that playlist. So I used to have a DJ that worked 6 hours. Now I have a guy that can pre-record all of his talking, which when you break it down, if all the other songs just automatically play, the commercials automatically play, there's no need to have a DJ physically there putting the commercial into the player, putting the song into the player. The computer's going to handle that, and we just slot in that pre-recorded DJ into his spot. So now our 6-hour shift, we can really boil down to about 30 minutes of him doing his pre-recordings. So if I've got a 6-hour employee that now is a 30-minute employee, one of the things I can do is say, okay, with this technology and with the ability to pre-record, I have a digital file of that pre-recording of that DJ. Now I can get them to pre-record not just for my station here, but for all of my other stations. I can have him say something generic enough, or her generic enough, so that it could apply to any station in the U.S. This is why if you listen to big city radio, it sounds generic in terms of the DJs and the personalities there. It's because it's formulated to be that way. Because they're going to reuse that voice, that DJ, in some other market. They pre-record the file, they email it, send it via the network to the other station, and the other station just plugs it into their playlist, right? So now I can, in terms of DJ broadcasts, whereas 6 hours used to give me 6 hours just at one station, now 6 hours can be a DJ working at 30 stations. I'm saving lots of money, right? But I'm also getting a DJ who's saying the exact same thing in 300 markets or 30 markets, right? Your diversity of thought has just been diminished. So if we look at what has prevailed over time, just a few quick kind of examples of this, right? And this really is just trying to demonstrate what I was talking about with the FCC originally being created to foster diversity of thought, but the FCC approves these mergers and deals so that even though it was supposed to, if you look historically, and by historically I mean since the inception or the installment of the FCC, if you look at all the decisions that the FCC has made historically, they tend to favor consolidation. They are getting rid of this diversity of thought. And you just have to look at the numbers and you'll see that. In the early days of broadcasting, you could own 7 AM stations, 7 FM, 7 TV stations, with no two being in the same market. Okay? So you could have multiple stations, but you couldn't have any in the same market, because then you would start to control that market's thought, right? 1980s, we changed that. 1980s, now you can own 12 AM, 12 FM, 12 TV. But your TV stations could only reach 25% of the American population. In other words, you could own 12 TV stations, but you couldn't own a TV station in Miami, New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, Denver, Dallas, Detroit. You couldn't own your 12 stations in the big cities, because that's a lot of voters, and that would give you a lot of control of the American vote if your stations were in the 12 largest cities in America, right? You could not own both a TV station and a radio station in the same local market. So again, in the 80s, we allow more consolidation. What the FCC does is it's putting these little stopgap measures, these things that look like they're trying to protect local interests. But at the end of the day, you just went from 7 to 12. So it's nice to have these little stipulations. You're still allowing the industry to consolidate. And then we have the thing that burst the dam. The Telecom Act of 1996 brought massive changes to consolidation. Why? If you think about what's happening in 1996, it makes sense as to why we almost took all of the restrictions off of consolidation. In 1996, what you have is you have the internet becoming seen by the majority of America as a business venture. You see the internet coming up, and the World Wide Web in particular, and you're thinking, okay, this internet, this AOL or CompuServe or those early companies, Earthlink, these companies aren't just providing email. They're providing access to the World Wide Web. And it's only a matter of time before people figure out, just like they figured out how to sell stuff on radio, how to sell stuff on TV, they're going to figure out how to sell it on the internet. And not only are they going to be able to advertise all this stuff on the internet, you will physically be able to buy it through the internet. You know, you hear an ad on the radio, you can't give the radio your credit card and have that thing show up in a few days. You hear an ad on the TV, you can't necessarily give the TV your credit card and have that thing show up in a few days. The internet you get both your advertising and purchasing power. America is worried about this. It knows that it's good at technology, but it definitely has competitors. China, Japan. These are countries that are going to have the internet. They're going to have the World Wide Web and therefore be able to communicate anywhere. They also have cheap labor, right? You think about why most everything is made in China. It's because they don't have to pay the people in China the same amount that they pay people in the United States. So we have these companies that are setting up, getting ready to use the internet to make money, and they're positioned where they can outperform us. So the Telecom Act of 96 says, all right, this is a new day and a new age then, right? Every so often you get a renewal of the Telecommunications Act, every so many years. This was just the version that happened in 1996, and it's where President Clinton basically says, okay, we need a major change in how we treat media because we're about to get outplayed by these other countries. So they revisit everything in that act. And what they come up with is they say, okay, if we want our big media companies to compete with China and Japan, we have to allow them the opportunity to consolidate. We have to allow them to take advantage of the free enterprise system and capitalism that we have in America. So they take some of those restrictions off, right? One of the biggest changes in that you see is they just kind of offhandedly think, well, yeah, we'll just reduce consolidation, or we'll just encourage consolidation in all sectors of the media. Well, that meant that also radio blows up after 96. There's no national limit to the number of stations you can own. And so we get Clear Channel, who buys, as a result of this, Clear Channel Radio grew from having 43 stations to 1,200 stations nationwide. They eventually bought themselves into bankruptcy, Clear Channel did, because they invested all this money in these stations thinking we are about to be the one and only major player in radio, right? They thought this was going to be a big deal. This was win-win. So they invest in 1,200 stations. Guess what happens at the turn of the century after they've made all this investment? Satellite radio. Satellite radio comes in and kills this deal that they did. Now we're competing. This is what Clear Channel's thinking. Now we're competing with satellite radio, which basically has one distribution system, and we're distributing our content over 1,200 different operations. We have to pay for these 1,200 operations to keep going. And satellite is putting out a product that people want and people are willing to pay for. And initially it's ad-free, and so Clear Channel ends up making the wrong play there, and they overspend themselves. They end up going bankrupt. Also, as a result of this Telecom Act of 96, you see about $300 billion worth of major media deals occur seemingly overnight. Everyone understands the reins are off, we can go. And they start trying to buy up everything. You still had something, this 25% rule. You can have TV stations, but not to more than 25%. That get eased up to 35%, right? You can have a regional or local limit on the number of radio stations you can own. In other words, you can only own 3 or 4 in one market. But as long as you keep shifting markets, you can own as many as you want across the country, right? So what we see again is here's the FCC saying, well, yeah, but we still have rules. We still have rules. But more and more, they're favoring consolidation. Okay? So we'll pick up with this in section 7, but this is the last slide for now. Thank you for your attention.